Why would God tell the same story 4 times? A history teacher in Texas thought he knew his Bible until one question refused to leave him alone. 4 Gospels, 4 writers, 1 Jesus. And the answer he uncovered would change everything he thought he understood about faith itself. For 7 years, the question had followed Daniel Carter like a shadow he could not shake. He was a good man, a patient man, the kind of history teacher who stayed late so a struggling student wouldn't feel alone. He had read the Bible cover to cover more times than he could count. He could recite the names of the 12 disciples in order. He knew the geography of ancient Israel better than he knew his own neighborhood. And yet there was one thing he had never been able to explain. Not to his students, not to his wife, not even to himself. Why 4 Gospels, 4 separate books? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. 4 different men telling the story of the same man. 4 accounts that sometimes lined up perfectly and sometimes seemed to wander in completely different directions. It bothered him more than he ever admitted out loud, because if he was being truthful with himself, one perfect story would have been enough. 1 book, 1 timeline, 1 clean, complete biography of Jesus of Nazareth. That was how history was supposed to work. That was how Daniel had been trained to think. So why 4? One evening, long after the town had gone quiet, Daniel sat in the back room of an old church library, surrounded by books older than his grandfather. He had told his wife he'd be home by 9. It was already past 10. An older man shuffled in behind him. His name was Walter, a retired minister who had spent 50 years in that church and now spent most of his days shelving books nobody borrowed anymore. "You've been staring at those 4 Gospels for 2 hours, son," Walter said quietly. "Something eating at you." Daniel didn't look up. "Can I ask you something honest, Walter?" That's the only kind of question worth asking. Daniel finally turned. Why did God give us 4 Gospels? Why not 1? 1 clear account, 1 complete story. Wouldn't that have settled everything? Wouldn't that have silenced every argument, every doubt, every skeptic who says the Bible contradicts itself? Walter didn't answer right away. He pulled out a chair, sat down slowly, the way older men sit when their knees remind them of every mile they've walked. And then he smiled the way a man smiles when he's been waiting years for someone to finally ask the right question. That, Walter said, is the question that separates the people who read the Bible from the people who understand it. Daniel leaned forward. Then explain it to me, because I've read these 4 books 100 times and I still feel like I'm missing something. You are missing something, Walter said gently. You're missing the reason. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Walter reached across the table and tapped the 4 books one at a time. Tell me, Daniel, when your father passed, how many people spoke at his funeral? The question caught Daniel off guard. His throat tightened. 4, he said quietly. My mother, my brother, his old business partner, and me. And did all 4 of you tell the exact same story about him? No. Daniel almost laughed at the memory. My mother talked about how gentle he was. My brother talked about how tough he could be. His partner talked about his handshake, how his word was law. And I talked about how he taught me to fish. 4 people, Walter said softly. 4 stories. 1 father. Now tell me, if you had to erase 3 of those speeches and keep only 1, which one would give the world the complete picture of who your father really was? Daniel opened his mouth, and then he stopped. Because he couldn't answer. He couldn't choose. Every single one of those stories was true. Every one was necessary. Remove even one, and his father shrank on the page. Became smaller, flatter, less real. And in that instant, something cracked open inside Daniel Carter that had been sealed shut for 7 years. You're saying, he whispered, that 1 story would never have been enough. Walter's eyes glistened. I'm saying that some people are too big for 1 voice to carry. Daniel sat back, stunned. His hands were trembling slightly, and he wasn't entirely sure why. Then who? he asked. Who was each one written for, because they can't all be saying the exact same thing to the exact same people? That doesn't make sense either. Now, Walter said, now you're finally asking the questions that matter. The old minister leaned in, and his voice dropped the way a man's voice drops when he's about to hand you something precious. These 4 books were never meant to compete with each other, Daniel. They were never meant to be 4 copies of the same painting. They were meant to be 4 windows. 4 windows looking at the same person from 4 different sides. And only when you look through all 4 at once do you finally see the whole man standing in the middle. Daniel felt the hair on his arms rise. Matthew, Walter continued, was written to convince a people who had waited 1,000 years for a king. To them, Matthew shouts one thing above all else. Your king has come, the one your prophets promised. He's here. Daniel scribbled the word into his notebook. King, Mark, Walter went on, was written for a very different crowd, written for Romans, for people who worshipped power and strength and conquest. And do you know what Mark shows them? Not a king on a throne, a servant on his knees, a ruler who came not to be served, but to give his own life away. Servant. Daniel wrote it down, his handwriting shaking. Luke, Walter said, and here his voice softened even more. Luke was a physician, a man of science, a man who chased down eyewitnesses and checked the facts because he needed to know the truth. And what did Luke discover? He discovered a Savior who loved the exact people everyone else had thrown away. The poor, the sick, the outcast, the forgotten, the guilty. Luke's Jesus goes running toward the very people the world runs from. Daniel's pen hovered over the page. His eyes were wet now, and he didn't try to hide it. And John, Walter said. He paused. John is different from all of them. Different how? Daniel breathed. The other 3 tell you what Jesus did, Walter said. John tells you who Jesus is. John doesn't begin with a birth. He doesn't begin with a family tree. John begins before the world was even made, before there was time, before there was light. And John dares to ask the one question the other 3 only whisper around. Which question? Walter looked him dead in the eyes. What if this man was not only a man? What if the carpenter from Nazareth was God himself walking on the same dirt we walk on? The room fell utterly silent. Daniel felt something move through his chest that he could not name. It was not fear, it was not doubt. It was something closer to standing on the edge of a cliff and realizing the ground you'd trusted your whole life was so much wider and deeper than you ever imagined. 4 writers, Walter said, ticking them off one finger at a time. A hated tax collector, a young man who wrote down another man's memories, a careful doctor, and a fisherman who loved Jesus more than his own life. 4 men who could not have been more different. 4 audiences who could not have been more opposed. And somehow, impossibly, they all point to the same face. Daniel closed his notebook slowly. So the reason there are 4, he said almost to himself, isn't because the Bible is confused. It's because Jesus was too big for one story to hold. Walter smiled, and there were tears sliding down the deep lines of his face now. Now you understand why I've waited so long for someone to ask. But Daniel wasn't finished. Because a new thought had risen up inside him, and it frightened him more than any question he'd ever asked. Walter, he said slowly, if each of these books was showing me a different side of the same person, then for 7 years I haven't been reading 4 contradictions. No, Walter said. I've been reading 4 confessions. Yes. Daniel's voice broke. And I never really saw him. Not fully. Not once. Walter reached across the table one last time and placed his weathered hand over Daniel's. Then let me make you a promise, son. In the days ahead, we are going to open all 4 of these windows one at a time. We're going to stand where Matthew stood and see the crown. We're going to kneel where Mark knelt and see the sacrifice. We're going to weep where Luke wept and see the mercy. And then we're going to look up where John looked up and see the glory. And when we've looked through all 4, Walter's grip tightened. You are going to see a face you have spent your whole life reading about and somehow never truly met." Daniel didn't say a word, because deep in his chest, in a place older than his doubts and stronger than his questions, he already knew that when the fourth window finally opened, nothing about him would ever be the same again. And the strangest part of all was this: he wasn't afraid of that anymore. He was ready. They came back the next night and the night after that until the back room of that old church library became something like sacred ground between them. Walter opened the first window. "Matthew," he said, sliding the book across the table. "Read me the first page, out loud." Daniel opened it and immediately his shoulders slumped. "Walter, it's a list of names, a genealogy. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob. This is the part everyone skips." "Everyone skips it," Walter agreed, "because everyone misses it." "Tell me something, Daniel. If you were writing the most important story in human history and you knew you had one shot to grab your reader, would you open with a page of names nobody can pronounce?" "No, I'd open with something dramatic." "So either Matthew was a fool," Walter said, "or that list of names was the most dramatic thing he could possibly say." Daniel looked down at the page again, and this time he read it differently. "He was writing to Jewish people," Daniel said slowly. "He was. People who had waited 1,000 years for a promise. And what promise were they waiting for? A Messiah, a king from the line of David. Now look at the very first sentence of the whole book. Not verse 10, not chapter 3, the first sentence." Daniel read it and his voice caught. "The genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. You see it now." Walter leaned in. "Before Matthew tells you a single story, before one miracle, before one word, Jesus ever spoke, he plants a flag. He connects this carpenter to Abraham, the father of the whole nation, and to David, the greatest king they ever had." To a Jewish reader, that list of names wasn't boring. It was a trumpet blast. It was Matthew standing up and shouting, "The king you've been waiting for 1,000 years is finally here, and here is his royal bloodline to prove it." Daniel sat back stunned that a page he'd skipped his entire life had been screaming at him the whole time. And it doesn't stop there. Walter pressed on, and now his voice picked up speed, urgent, like he couldn't get the words out fast enough. Matthew does it again and again. The birthplace, Bethlehem, just as the prophet said. The escape to Egypt, the words spoken over the Jordan when his ministry begins. Every major moment, Matthew points back and says, "This was written. This was promised. This is fulfillment. Nothing about this man is an accident." "He's building a case," Daniel whispered. "Like a lawyer." "Like a lawyer laying evidence before a jury," Walter said. "And here's what breaks me every time. Do you know who this lawyer was? Do you know what Matthew did for a living before he wrote this?" Daniel shook his head. "He was a tax collector." Daniel blinked. "That's it, a tax collector." Walter's eyes flashed. "You say that like an American son. You don't feel the weight of it. In that world, a tax collector wasn't just unpopular. He was a traitor, a Jew who worked for Rome, the very empire crushing his own people. He took money from his neighbors and handed it to the enemy and skimmed a fortune off the top for himself. When Matthew walked down the street, mothers pulled their children away from him. His own family may have disowned him. To his people, he was the lowest of the low, a sellout, a thief, a collaborator. Tumbo. Daniel stared at the book in his hands, as though it had transformed. "And that man," Walter said, "that despised, hated, rejected man is the one who wrote the single most powerful argument in all of history that Jesus is the true King of Israel." "Why would Jesus pick him?" Daniel asked. "Of all people." That, Walter said, is exactly the question Matthew wants you to ask, because his own life is the argument. Jesus walked up to a tax collector sitting at his booth, a man everyone else had written off forever, and said 2 words, "Follow me." And Matthew stood up and left everything behind. His whole story is proof of the very thing he's trying to convince you of, that this king doesn't rule like other kings. He blesses the poor. He welcomes the sinner. He calls the traitor and makes him a saint. He doesn't rule through fear. He rules through a love that reaches down and lifts up the very people the world spits on. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and didn't care that Walter saw. "All right," he said, his voice thick. "Open the second window." Walter slid Mark across the table. "Now brace yourself, because if Matthew opens like a royal record, Mark opens like a house on fire." Daniel read the first lines and frowned. There's no genealogy at all, no birth story, no childhood. He just starts, right in the middle of the action. "Right in the middle," Walter said, and he was almost breathless now. "No introduction, no warm-up. Mark grabs you by the collar and throws you into the deep end. And do you notice the pace? Read a few pages. What's the word that keeps repeating?" Daniel scanned, and his eyebrows rose. "Immediately. Immediately Jesus did this. Immediately he went there. Immediately. It's everywhere," Walter said. "Mark is running and he's making you run with him. Jesus is always moving, healing, teaching, serving, casting out demons. There's no time to catch your breath. And who do you think that was written for?" "Someone who liked action," Daniel guessed. "Someone impatient." "Romans," Walter said. "The most powerful people on earth. People who worshipped strength and speed and conquest. People who respected a man of action, not a man of words. So Mark gives them action. He gives them a Jesus who never stops moving. But here's the twist, Daniel. Here's the thing that would have knocked a Roman flat on his back." Walter's finger stabbed the page. "He gives them a king of action whose greatest action is to lose." Daniel went still. "A Roman expected a hero who conquered," Walter said, "who crushed his enemies and stood on their necks. And Mark shows them a king whose whole life is racing toward one place, and that place is a cross. Every step, every mile, every immediately is carrying him toward the moment he gives his own life away. Find me the sentence, the one where Jesus tells them why he came." Daniel searched, and then he found it, and he read it slowly. "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." The words hung in the air between them. "To a Roman," Walter said quietly. That sentence was insane. Power was the point. Ruling was the point. Being served was the point. And here is a king who kneels, a king who washes feet, a king who dies for the very people beneath him. Mark took everything the Roman world believed about power and turned it upside down. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that had been building in him. "Walter, if Mark was trying to convince tough Romans that Jesus was worth following, why does he make the disciples look so bad? I've noticed it. They're always confused. They doubt. They argue. Peter is a mess. If I were selling a movement, I'd hide all of that." Walter smiled, and it was a slow, knowing smile. "You just found the most honest thing about the whole book." "What do you mean?" "Mark doesn't hide the failures. He puts them front and center, and there's a reason for that. Do you know whose memories Mark was writing down?" Daniel shook his head. "Peter's," Walter said. Mark was Peter's man. He wrote down the memories of Peter himself. And that changes everything. Because Peter was the one who failed the worst. Peter was the loudest, the boldest, the one who swore he'd die before he ever abandoned Jesus. And then on the darkest night when it counted most, Peter denied he even knew him. 3 times. Cursed and swore he'd never met the man. Daniel's breath caught. "So when you read Mark showing Peter at his worst," Walter said, "you're not reading an enemy attacking Peter. You're reading Peter confessing his own failure. He left it in. He wanted it in there." "Why?" Daniel whispered. "Why would a man broadcast his greatest shame to the whole world?" Walter leaned all the way across the table, and his voice dropped to almost nothing. "Because Peter understood something that took me 50 years to learn. The message of Mark was never that perfect people follow Jesus. If it were, none of us would qualify. The message is that broken people failures, cowards, deniers, traitors can be restored. Peter left his failure in the book because Peter was living proof of what happens after the failure. Jesus didn't throw him away. Jesus rebuilt him. and the man who denied him 3 times became the rock the whole church was built on. Daniel put his hand over his mouth. When he finally spoke, his voice barely worked. So Matthew shows me a king who calls a traitor, and Mark shows me a servant who restores a coward. Now you're seeing it, Walter said. The king and the servant. Daniel looked down at the 2 books, and he felt the ground shifting under him again, wider and deeper than before. 2 windows, and I'm already looking at a man I never met. Walter closed Mark gently and set his hand on top of it. 2 down, son, he said softly. And I promise you the 2 that remain are going to take you places you have never been. Daniel didn't answer. He just reached for the 3rd book, and his hand was steady now because somewhere in the last hour the questions that had haunted him for 7 years had stopped feeling like doubts. They had started to feel like doors. The 3rd book felt heavier in Daniel's hands, though he knew that made no sense. Luke, he said. Where do I even start? Start with who Luke was, Walter answered. Because unlike the other 3, Luke wasn't even there. He never walked with Jesus. He never heard him teach. He never saw a single miracle with his own eyes. Daniel looked up sharply. Then how could he write a gospel? The way a good detective writes a case, Walter said. Luke was a physician, a doctor, a man trained to observe, to question, to check and double-check before he trusted anything. And he did something none of the others did. Read the very opening. Read what he tells you he's doing. Daniel found it, and his eyes widened as he read. He says he carefully investigated everything from the beginning, that he traced it all, talked to eyewitnesses, so that his reader would know the certain truth. A doctor's mind, Walter said. He chased down the people who were actually there. He interviewed them. He organized it. He wanted his reader to be sure. This wasn't a man passing along a rumor. This was a man building a record so solid you could stake your life on it. And here's the twist, Daniel. Do you know who scholars believe Luke's greatest eyewitness might have been? Who? Mary, the mother of Jesus herself. Because Luke tells us things no one else could have known. What the angel said to her. What she felt in her heart. The song she sang when she found out. Luke has details from inside that home that could only have come from one woman on earth. He didn't just read the story. He went and found the people who lived it. Daniel sat with that, the weight of it settling on him. So Luke is the historian, the one who nails it down. But what's his message? Every one of them has a message. Matthew had the king. Mark had the servant. What's Luke's? Walter's whole face changed. Something tender crept into it. Luke asks one question above all others, he said. Who does Jesus actually care about? And the answer, Daniel, the answer will break your heart if you let it. Tell me. Everyone the world threw away. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Watch how Luke tells the birth. Walter said his words, picking up speed now. The King of the universe is born, the most important night in history. And who does God invite first? Not kings, not priests, not the rich or the powerful or the respected. Shepherds. Do you understand what shepherds were? Dirty, poor working men that decent society looked down on. Men whose word wasn't even accepted in a court of law because nobody trusted them. And those are the first faces at the manger. God sent the announcement of his son to the men everyone else ignored. Daniel's pen had stopped moving. He was just listening now. And it never lets up, Walter pressed on. Luke is the one who gives us the story of the Good Samaritan. Do you feel how scandalous that was, a Samaritan? A group the religious people despised, looked down on, would cross the road to avoid. And Jesus makes him the hero, the one who stops, the one who helps, the one who does what the respectable religious men walked right past. He flipped it, Daniel murmured. He made the outsider the good one. He did it on purpose, Walter said. And then there's the story that undoes me every single time, the one about the son who threw his whole life away. Daniel knew it. The prodigal son. The boy takes his father's money, demands his inheritance while his father is still alive, which was as good as saying, I wish you were dead. And then he wastes all of it. Every penny. on nothing. He ends up so low he's feeding pigs starving, wishing he could eat the slop the animals ate. And finally, he decides to crawl home. He rehearses a speech. He's going to beg to be treated like a servant, because he knows he doesn't deserve to be called a son anymore. Walter's voice cracked. And here's the part, Daniel. Here's the part that should stop every one of us in our tracks. The Father sees him, while he's still a long way off, which means the Father was watching, waiting, looking down that road every single day, hoping. And when he sees that boy, that filthy, broken, disgraced boy, the Father doesn't wait for the apology. He runs. An old man running, which was undignified, which was shameful in that culture, and he doesn't care. He throws his arms around his ruined son, and he can't even let him finish his speech before he's calling for a robe and a ring and a feast. Daniel's eyes were streaming, and he made no move to stop them. He was welcomed home, Walter said softly, before he could even finish his apology. For a moment, neither man could speak. That's Luke's whole message, Walter finally said. That's the door he's throwing open for every human being who ever felt too far gone. Women who counted for so little in that world. The poor, the sick, the rejected, the guilty, the lonely, the ones who did it to themselves. Luke keeps showing you a God who doesn't wait behind a locked gate, a God who runs down the road toward the very people the world runs away from. Daniel wiped his face with both hands. Walter, I have felt like that, son. More than once in my life. I have felt too far gone. So has every honest person who ever lived, Walter said gently. And that's why Luke wrote it down. So you'd know. No matter how far you ran, the Father never stopped watching that road. There is no one, Daniel. No one too broken. No one too dirty. No one too late. That's the message Luke bled onto every page. No one is beyond the reach of that love. Daniel let the words wash over him. And when he finally lifted his head, he reached for the fourth book, and his hand trembled. Then there's John. Then there's John, Walter echoed, and something in his tone shifted. Went quiet, went almost reverent, like a man about to step onto holy ground. Why do you say his name differently? Daniel asked. Because the first three ask questions you can wrestle with, Walter said. Matthew asks, is Jesus the promised king? Mark asks, what did Jesus do? Luke asks, who does Jesus save? Big questions, hard questions. But John asks the one question you cannot escape, the one that will not let you stay comfortable. What question? Walter looked at him. Who is Jesus really? Daniel opened the book, and immediately he felt the difference. There's no genealogy, no shepherds, no manger, no birth at all. He starts with, in the beginning. In the beginning, Walter repeated. Does that phrase sound familiar? Daniel's blood ran cold. That's how Genesis starts. That's how the whole Bible starts. In the beginning God created. Now read what John does with it. Daniel read, and his voice began to shake. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The room seemed to go completely silent. Do you see what he just did? Walter whispered. Matthew traced Jesus back to Abraham 1,000 years. Luke traced him all the way back to Adam, the first man. But John traces him back before there was a first man, before there was an earth, before there was light or time or anything at all. John reaches back before the beginning of everything and says he was already there, and he wasn't just with God. He was God, Daniel breathed. That is the bomb John drops on the very first line, Walter said. The other three build the case slowly. John kicks the door down. He tells you before anything else that this carpenter, this man who ate and slept and wept and bled, was the eternal God who spoke the stars into being, now wrapped in human skin. The Word became flesh, John says. God moved into the neighborhood. God became one of us. Daniel gripped the edge of the table like the floor might give way. And watch what John does with the miracles. Walter went on, relentless now. He records fewer than the others, but every one he chooses is a signpost pointing at that one truth. water into wine, a dying boy healed from miles away, a man paralyzed for 38 years standing up and walking, thousands fed with a boy's lunch, a man born blind opening his eyes and seeing color for the first time in his life. Each one bigger than the last, Daniel said. Each one climbing higher, Walter agreed. Until John brings you to the edge, to a tomb, to a man named Lazarus 4 days dead, already decaying, and his sisters weeping, and everyone certain it's over. And Jesus stands in front of that grave and calls a dead man by name, and Lazarus walks out. Daniel couldn't breathe. Do you see it now? Walter said, his voice rising. Every sign in John is building to one unbearable conclusion. This man has authority over sickness, over nature, over hunger, over blindness, and finally, over the one enemy no king, no emperor, no doctor, no power on earth has ever defeated: death itself. John is showing you sign by sign that the man from Nazareth holds the keys to the grave. Daniel set the book down slowly, and when he looked up, his face had changed. Something had broken open in him, and something new was standing in its place. 4 windows, he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. The King, the Servant, the Savior, and now, God Himself. Walter nodded, and there were tears sliding down the old lines of his face. And every one of them. Daniel said, the realization crashing over him, is looking at the same face. The same face, Walter repeated, and he let those words settle before he spoke again. Now, Daniel, now we've reached the moment I've been waiting for, because you came to me with a question 7 years old, and I think you're finally ready to hear the answer whole. Daniel looked up. The question, why 4? Why 4? Walter said. Lay them out in front of you, all 4, side by side. Daniel spread the books across the table, and he stared at them like a man seeing them for the very first time. Now tell me what each one gave you, Walter said. In one word, don't think, just say it. Matthew, Daniel said. The crown. Yes. Mark, the sacrifice. Yes. Luke, the compassion. Keep going. John. Daniel's voice caught. The glory. Walter leaned back, and a slow, aching smile spread across his face. The crown, the sacrifice, the compassion, and the glory. Now, Daniel, take any one of them away, just one, and tell me what happens. Daniel stared at the 4 books, and something began to dawn on him. If I take away Matthew, he said slowly, I lose the king. I lose the 1,000-year promise. I lose the proof that this was always the plan, that none of it was an accident. And if you take away Mark, I lose the servant. I lose the cross at the center of it all. I lose the king who kneels. He swallowed. I'd have a crown with no sacrifice under it. And Luke, Daniel's throat tightened. I lose the running father. I lose the shepherds and the Samaritan, and the son welcomed home. I lose the part that told me I wasn't too far gone. His voice broke. I lose the part that was for me. And John. Daniel couldn't answer for a moment. If I take away John, he finally said, then he's just a man, a good man, a great teacher, a kind healer, a martyr. But just a man. I lose the one thing that changes everything. I lose God in the flesh. Walter nodded slowly. So tell me now, son, could one book have carried all 4 of those? And there it was. The answer Daniel had chased for 7 years, sitting right in front of him, so simple and so enormous that he couldn't believe he'd never seen it. No, he whispered, no one book couldn't. It would have collapsed under the weight. If Matthew had tried to be everything, he'd have watered down the king. If John had tried to include everything, he'd have buried the glory under a pile of details. He looked up, stunned. They didn't overlap because they were confused, Walter. They didn't repeat each other because they couldn't get their story straight. Each one went deep on the one thing he was born to show. That's why there are 4. That's why there are 4, Walter echoed. They're not 4 contradictions, Daniel said. And now the words were pouring out of him. They're not even 4 biographies. They're 4 portraits, 4 artists, each one painting the same face from the side only he could see. Matthew painting the king from the front in full royal robes. Mark painting him from below on his knees. Luke painting him reaching down toward the gutter. And John painting him from above, glowing with the light of eternity. And you can't hang just one on the wall and say you've seen the man. Walter's eyes were shining. Now do you understand who painted them? What do you mean? Look at these 4 men, Daniel. Really look at them. Walter tapped the books one by one, and his voice climbed. Matthew, a tax collector. A traitor his own people despised. Mark, a young man who never led anything, writing down the memories of a fisherman who denied Jesus to his face. Luke, a Gentile doctor who wasn't even there, who had to hunt down the truth like a detective. And John, a fisherman with no education, who loved Jesus so much he couldn't stop reaching for words too big for him. He spread his hands over all 4, a traitor, a coward scribe, an outsider, and an unschooled fisherman. 4 men who couldn't have been more different, writing in different decades, to different people, in different cities, with different purposes. And Daniel. Walter's voice dropped to almost nothing. Not one of them ever sat down together to coordinate their story. Not one of them checked with the others to make sure it all lined up. And yet when you lay their 4 portraits side by side, they don't clash. They complete each other. 4 strangers painting the same face, and the pieces fit together like they came from a single hand. The hair stood up on Daniel's arms. Because they did, he said. Because they did, Walter said. You want to know the deepest reason there are 4 Gospels and not 1. It's not just that Jesus was too big for one voice, though. He was. It's that 4 ordinary, broken, mismatched men who never planned it together, all reached for the same person and pulled back the same truth. 4 independent witnesses. And in any court in the world, Daniel, 4 independent witnesses who agree are not a weakness. They're the strongest case there is. Daniel put his head in his hands. When he lifted it, his eyes were red. 7 years, he said. 7 years. I thought the 4 Gospels were a problem I had to explain away. A weakness. Something the skeptics could poke holes in. He laughed, but it came out shaking. And the whole time it was the opposite. The 4 of them weren't the crack in the foundation. They were the foundation. Now you understand your own funeral story, Walter said quietly. Daniel looked at him. 4 people spoke at your father's funeral, Walter said. Your mother, your brother, his partner, and you. 4 different stories. And you told me you couldn't erase a single one without shrinking who your father was. Do you remember what you said? Everyone was true, Daniel whispered. Everyone was necessary. That's the gospel, son. God stood at the center of human history, and he knew that one voice, one angle, one story could never hold him. So he didn't give us 1. He gave us 4. A tax collector to show us the crown. A young scribe to show us the cross. A doctor to show us the mercy. And a fisherman to show us the face of God. And only when you stand back and look through all 4 windows at once do you finally see the whole man standing in the middle of the room. Daniel sat in silence for a long time. And then something crossed his face, something that started as wonder and turned slowly into fear. Walter, he said, there's something I haven't said out loud. Say it. For 7 years I told myself the reason I couldn't answer this question was academic, historical. I told myself I was just a teacher who wanted his facts straight. He drew a shaking breath. But that was a lie. The real reason this question haunted me is that as long as the 4 Gospels were a contradiction, I had an excuse. As long as there was a crack, I didn't have to decide anything. I could keep them at arm's length. I could study him without ever having to face him. Walter didn't move. And now the crack is gone, Daniel said, and his voice broke completely. The excuse is gone. There's nothing between me and the man in the middle of the room anymore. 4 witnesses, all agreeing, all pointing at the same face, and I can't unsee it. No, Walter said gently. You can't. Daniel looked at the 4 books spread before him, and he understood at last that this had never really been about a question. The question had only been a door. And now that the door stood open, there was no walking back through it and pretending he'd never looked inside. The king, he said softly, touching Matthew. The servant. He touched Mark. The Savior. Luke. And God himself. John. He drew his hand back and he was trembling. One face, he said. One Jesus. And I've spent my whole life reading about him, and tonight is the first time I've truly seen him. Walter reached across the table one final time the way he had that very first night, and laid his weathered hand over Daniel's. Then the question that brought you here has done its work, the old man said. It carried you all the way to the one question that was underneath it the whole time. The question every one of these 4 men spent their lives forcing their readers to answer. Daniel looked up and he already knew what was coming. What are you going to do with him? Walter said. Now that you've finally seen his face, what are you going to do with Jesus? And for the first time in 7 years, Daniel Carter had no words at all. The silence stretched between them, and Walter let it. He had learned long ago that some silences do more work than 1,000 words. Finally, Daniel spoke, and his voice was raw. I don't know how to answer that. Not tonight. Maybe not for a long time. You don't have to answer it tonight, Walter said. But you can never unask it now. That's what these 4 books do to a person. Once you've truly seen the face in the middle of the room, you carry the question with you everywhere you go. To your kitchen table, to your classroom, to your bed at night when the house is quiet and there's nobody left to perform for. Daniel nodded slowly, and then a new thought struck him, and he looked up sharply. Walter, something you said. You said that after seeing all 4, nobody can stay neutral. What did you mean by that? I meant exactly what I said, Walter answered. Think about it. Before tonight, you had a comfortable option. You could keep Jesus at a distance and call it scholarship. You could admire him, study him, respect him as a great teacher, and leave it there. But these 4 men took that option away from you. They didn't write 4 gentle portraits of a nice man. They wrote 4 testimonies that all arrive at the same impossible claim. That he was God, Daniel said. That he was God, Walter said. And once a man makes that claim, once 4 independent witnesses back it, you are out of comfortable options. Because if it's false, then Jesus was either a liar or a madman, and you should throw these books in the fire and never think of him again. But if it's true... Walter leaned forward. If it's true, Daniel, then admiration isn't enough. Respect isn't enough. Calling him a great teacher is an insult because great teachers don't claim to be God. If it's true, there's only one response left to a human being, and it isn't the one you can give from a safe distance. Daniel felt the weight of it pressed down on him. That's the trap in all 4 Gospels, Walter said, and there was almost wonder in his voice. That's the thing they were built to do. They corner you. Gently, patiently, one portrait at a time, they close off every exit until you're standing in front of him, with nowhere left to hide, and the only thing left to decide is what you'll do with your knees. Daniel wiped his face with the back of his hand. I keep thinking about the 4 men, he said. You said not one of them coordinated the story. But there's something else about them, isn't there? Something you haven't said yet. Walter tilted his head. Tell me what you see. They all died for it. Daniel's voice dropped. Didn't they? These weren't men who wrote a story and moved on. They gave their lives. Matthew, Mark, Luke. Tradition says most of them were killed for refusing to take it back. Walter was quiet for a moment. The traditions vary, he said carefully. But yes, son, the early church remembered these men not as authors who cashed in, but as witnesses who paid. And here is what that means, and I want you to hold on to it. A man might lie for money. A man might lie for power. A man might even lie to protect himself. But 4 men from 4 different places do not all go to their deaths defending a story they secretly know they made up. People don't die for what they know is a lie. They die for what they've seen with their own eyes and cannot deny. Daniel closed his eyes. They saw him, he whispered. They actually saw him. The empty tomb, the risen Christ, and they'd rather die than say they didn't. That's the case, Daniel. That's the whole case laid on your table tonight. 4 witnesses, 4 portraits, 4 men who painted the same face from 4 sides, never coordinated, never matched their stories, and never took it back, not even with a blade at their throats. Walter's voice trembled now. If you were on a jury, and 4 strangers gave you testimony like that, and every one of them held to it under penalty of death, what would you conclude? Daniel opened his eyes, and they were wet, but they were steady. That they were telling the truth. That they were telling the truth, Walter said. For a long while, neither of them said anything. The 4 books lay open on the table between them, and somehow they no longer felt like ancient documents to be studied. They felt like 4 hands reaching across 2,000 years, each one pointing at the same person and saying the same thing. Come and see. Come and see. Come and see. Come and see. I owe you something, Walter, Daniel finally said. An apology maybe, or a thank you. I came in here 7 years ago carrying a question I thought made me sound smart. Why 4 Gospels? I asked it at dinner parties. I asked it to sound like a man who thought deeply. And the truth is, I was hiding behind it the whole time. I know, Walter said gently. I knew the first night you asked me. Daniel laughed softly through the tears. You knew, son. I've been shelving these books in this room for 50 years. I've watched 100 men ask that question with their mouth while their heart was asking something else entirely. The mind asks, why 4? But underneath, always the heart is asking, is it true? And is it true for me? Walter smiled. You weren't hiding as well as you thought. Daniel looked down at the 4 Gospels one last time, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. The tremor was gone. Something settled had taken its place. You told me on the first night that we'd open all 4 windows one at a time, that we'd stand where Matthew stood and see the crown, kneel where Mark knelt and see the sacrifice, weep where Luke wept and see the mercy, and look up where John looked up and see the glory. He drew a slow breath. And you said when we'd looked through all 4, I'd see a face I'd spent my whole life reading about and somehow never truly met. I did say that. You were right. Daniel's voice cracked, but he didn't stop. I've met him, Walter. For the first time in my life, I've actually met him. And I understand now that all along I thought I was the one studying these 4 books. I thought I was the investigator taking them apart, holding them up to the light. He shook his head slowly. But that's not what happened at all, was it? The whole time I was reading them, they were reading me. 4 witnesses examining me, asking me the one question I spent 7 years refusing to answer. Walter said nothing. He only nodded and let the tears run down the deep lines of his face. Daniel closed the 4 books one at a time, gently, the way a man closes something he intends to open again and again for the rest of his life. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the King, the servant, the Savior, and God himself. You asked me what I am going to do with him, Daniel said quietly. I don't have the whole answer yet, but I have the first part. I'm going to stop hiding. I'm going to stop studying him from a safe distance and calling it faith. I'm going to walk out of this room, and I'm going to go home to my wife, and I'm going to tell her that the question that's followed me for 7 years finally got answered tonight, and that the answer wasn't a fact. It was a face. He stood. And for a moment, he just looked at the old man who had waited so patiently all these years for someone to finally ask the right question. Thank you, Walter. Don't thank me, son, Walter said, rising slowly to his feet. I didn't do anything but point. That's all any of us can ever do. Matthew pointed. Mark pointed. Luke pointed. John pointed. And now an old man in a church library pointed too. We're all just fingers aimed at the same face. Daniel smiled, and there was peace in it. And now the question belongs to everyone who has heard this story, because you have stood at the same 4 windows tonight. You have seen the crown Matthew painted, and the cross Mark could not hide, and the running Father that broke Luke's heart, and the glory John reached back before time itself to show you. You have heard the testimony of 4 ordinary, broken, mismatched men who never coordinated their story, and never took it back, not even when it cost them everything. 4 witnesses, pointing across 2,000 years at one unforgettable face. And here is the truth that will not let you go. You can admire him, you can question him, you can spend a lifetime studying him from a safe and comfortable distance, but you cannot ignore him, not anymore. Not after you've seen all 4 portraits hanging side by side. Because the God who knew that one voice could never hold him did not leave you with a puzzle to solve. He left you with a person to answer. 4 Gospels, 4 perspectives, 1 Savior, 1 story, and 1 question that now rests in your hands, the same question that turned a doubting history teacher into a man who finally saw the face he'd read about his whole life. After seeing all 4 portraits of Jesus, what will you do with him? Because in the end, he was never too complicated to understand. He was only too great for 1 story to hold. So God gave the world 4. And through those 4 voices across every generation that has ever lived, the lost have been found, the broken have been healed, and the ones who thought they were too far gone have discovered that the Father was watching that road the whole time. He is the King who came for you. He is the servant who died for you. He is the Savior who runs toward you still. And he is God who stepped out of eternity and into human skin so that you would never again have to wonder what his face looks like. Look at all 4 and you will see him. And once you have truly seen him, you will never be the same again.